Also, in one of your interviews at Sky News, you said that Russian army, you can't imagine that Russian army would be able to go into 2026. How much time do they still have for this war effort?
Well, I mean, the Russian army can keep on fighting, but it will get much harder for them into 2026 because the increase in war production in Russia has reached something of a plateau. They can keep increasing numbers and they may get more help from North Korea and more help from China. That's entirely possible, and they're already getting quite a lot of help from Iran. So the Russians may find ways of maintaining the flow of weapons to the front line and their own weapon stocks and their own ability to create more weapons. But I don't think they'll be able to maintain this tempo of operations, this very high tempo that we've seen throughout 2025, through the winter and into the spring and summer of 2026. I mean, I think the Russians will try to mount an offensive sometime, probably not this year, but sometime early next year. But it would be surprising to me if such an offensive were very powerful, because they're pushing most of their available forces onto the front line immediately. I mean, we're not seeing any evidence of Russian forces being taken away from the front line for 6 or 8 months to train in a more efficient way of fighting the war. If they were back in Russia training, there'd be more expectation of a powerful offensive. But I think there'll be offensive operations, but probably more of the same. And when it comes to the fortress belt from Slavyansk to Kramatorsk to Druzhkivka and Kostiantynivka, the Russians are close to that fortress belt, but they've not been able to take it in almost 3 years. And I don't believe the Russians can conquer those cities until at least next year, even if they put all of their effort into it. I think those cities, although it's miserable living there, I think those cities are fairly safe, at least for well into 2026.
Let's cover situation on the ground. How can you assess the main results of Russia's summer campaign in Ukraine? And the second question will be about this belt of fortress. From your perspective, would the Russian army be able to capture these defense lines anytime soon in case of Putin conducting, for example, full-scale mobilization?
The Russians spent almost a year trying to capture Bakhmut and taking Bakhmut. And in the event, of course, they destroyed it before they were able to move in and occupy the rubble. And the fact is, Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are 3 times bigger than Bakhmut and better and fortified in a better position. And they're in a better geographical location on high ground with ridges to their east and so on. I think the Russians would have a real problem in trying to really break into any of those 4 big fortress cities from Slavyansk to Kostiantynivka. I don't think they can do it. So unless those fortress cities are given to them in some sort of crazy peace deal, which I don't believe will happen, they can't take them. Now, next year, if they were prepared to go in for full mobilization, then that might change the dynamic. But even so, they'd have to devote enormous resources because they are the most defensible parts of the whole front line as far as Ukraine is concerned. And, you will know better than me that Ukraine has fought for those cities since 2014. So they've held those cities as fortresses for 11 years now, and I don't think they'll fall very quickly. The point about the Russian offensives are that the Russians have changed their style, and they're now going in for, as it were, deep raiding. So as we saw in Dobropilya, they created raiding parties, small, not very well supported parties, to go deep inside or through Ukrainian lines to seize a little bit of territory, but they weren't able to follow up on it. And so although the Russians can creep forward with lightly armed troops, actually performing almost suicide missions, they can achieve some positions. They still find it hard to break through in a way that is strategically relevant. So that their tactics and their abilities are always to keep pushing across the whole front and make small gains wherever they can. And they are making gains. We've got to be completely honest about that. But none of these gains, none of them, seem like a breakthrough in terms of maneuver warfare, because maneuver warfare requires, at some point, heavy forces with heavy armor being able to spearhead through a gap in the opponent's lines, in the enemy lines, and then circle around behind them to isolate a brigade or a corps, a significant number of troops, and thereby grab a large piece of territory. The Russians have not done anything like that since Lysychansk. The last place in which they conducted a little bit of that was when Severodonetsk was abandoned. Then Lysychansk was the next place on the other side of the river. The Russians did conduct something like a maneuver battle, but it was a fairly small scale thing, and they've not managed anything remotely like that since. And I don't see any indication in their training or their tactics that they're able to do it anytime soon. So if we see them do it next year, they will have to put a lot of effort into retraining troops to do it properly.
Let's cover also political aspect of the war in Ukraine and these negotiations between the US, Russia and Ukraine. Russia is unwilling to organize a personal meeting between Ukrainian President Zelensky and Russian dictator Vladimir Putin, but do they still have any cards to play with Donald Trump to avoid possible sanctions? And don't you think that Russia has already used its all cards with Donald Trump by presenting this opportunity to conduct summit between Trump and Putin? And what comes next?
Well, the Russians clearly seem to believe that they can carry on doing what they're doing, and that ultimately the United States under Donald Trump will allow them to do it. That they seem to feel that they can continue the war in Ukraine because they know that Trump isn't interested in Ukraine as such. He wants to get the Ukrainian war out of the way, off his desk. Now, he also very much wants to be the peacemaker. He wants to convene a major international conference which would create at least a ceasefire. And that's not going to happen because Putin has convinced him now that a ceasefire is not relevant and he's got to go for the whole peace deal. He won't get it. I'm absolutely certain that there will not be a peace conference in any meaningful sense this year. I'm absolutely certain of that. Although the Americans talk about it and people are working towards it, as I've said on other occasions, all of this on the Ukrainian side, on the Russian side, on the European side, it's all shadow boxing to actually convince Washington that we are in favor of a peace conference if only it could happen. And that's what the Russians are trying to do, to say, well, yes, of course, we could have a peace conference, but we've got lots of things to sort out first, lots of things to be agreed first. And that's a way of keeping it in the distance, keep pushing it back. Whereas President Zelensky said in March he would agree to a 30-day ceasefire. President Zelensky has said repeatedly, I will meet President Putin. He said repeatedly that we can talk about a peace deal. We can talk about some of the things that would have to be discussed if Russia is prepared to come into the room with us. But so far, the Russians have backed away from that. And this whole diplomatic merry-go-round of the last 2 weeks since Alaska is based on, first of all, optimism from Steve Witkoff's visit to the Kremlin. Steve Witkoff came away from the Kremlin with a very vague idea that the Russians were prepared to make quite big concessions. The European partners of the United States were very skeptical about that. It didn't agree with any of their own interpretations of what Russia was doing. And since then, Steve Witkoff has changed his interpretation of what the Russians said to him. But on the basis of Witkoff's optimism, President Trump rushed towards the summit in Alaska, and suddenly it all dissolved because the Russians, surprise, surprise, are really not in the mood to make any concessions whatsoever. So what we're doing is going through a process of pretending that a peace conference is possible, whereas we all know it is not, but we all want to show good faith so that Donald Trump doesn't blame Zelensky and Ukraine for the collapse of peace talks, doesn't blame the Europeans for it. But equally, of course, the Russians are trying to maneuver Trump into a position where he does blame Zelensky for everything that is not happening on the peace talks front.
But don't you think that this Kremlin's decision to give Trump a personal meeting summit could turn into the biggest mistake ever? Because President Trump has invested so much his personal time, reputation and political effort in this big widely covered summit with Vladimir Putin, and although he has invested lots of time, progress has not been made. Could this just turn Trump against Putin?
Yes, I mean, you're right. You're right in the sense that Trump is desperate for a big deal. He's desperate for an era-defining deal to bring this worst war in the world at the moment to an end. So he wants that, and the Russians are playing a very dangerous game in preventing him from having it. But it still comes back to the reality that every time President Putin and Donald Trump meet, and it's not just as heads of state. I mean, every time they've met in the last 10 or more years, and sometimes they've met at summits on the G20 or in the United Nations at the General Assembly. Sometimes they've had phone calls. Sometimes they've had internet meetings or meetings online. And then all the 2 or 3 direct summits they've had. Every single time, Putin dominates Trump. Putin dominates him intellectually, politically, and morally. And I think Putin, he may overplay his hand, but Putin seems to be very confident that he can manipulate Trump into blaming everybody else for, and particularly blaming Ukraine for the breakdown in talks. Of course, it may be that Donald Trump cannot let go of the idea of this major conference which will secure his place in history. But I think he's already, if you look at his statements, they're very inconsistent, of course. Everything he does is inconsistent. But, I mean, a lot of his statements also are giving him the option of saying, well, I tried. It wasn't possible. I can't make 2 warring parties make peace if they won't make peace. And, of course, in this respect, he's trying to blame both sides equally without any indication that he understands that this is a war of aggression of one state against another. Whereas Keith Kellogg made it very clear that these attacks were completely unacceptable and were attacks on civilians in Kiev, Caroline Levitt, who is the spokesperson for Donald Trump in the White House, she said, yes, of course, the Russians have attacked Kiev, and that's very bad. But equally, the Ukrainians have attacked oil refineries in Samara and Krasnodar, as if somehow attacks on military targets in Samara and Krasnodar are the moral equivalent of direct attacks on civilians in Kiev. And that indicates, of course, that the White House is preparing for at least one line of argument which says 2 sides equally to blame, won't stop fighting, so there's nothing I can do. And I think that is probably where Donald Trump is going to finish up in this conflict. I think that he is zigzagging his way out of any involvement in this war.